I'm thrilled now for our final panel to hand over to Sheila Dillon, arguably the country's leading food journalist, host of the food programme and all-round national treasure. Sheila will be putting the question of the day to a fantastic panel of speakers, and I'll let Sheila introduce them. Over to you, Sheila.
Thank you very much, Ben. Sustain, for me, has been the ideas and change generator ever since I joined the food programme, the group that's done the thinking about a better future. I mean, we have a national food strategy in the making, in great part because of Sustain. It wouldn't be there otherwise. And as you heard in those 2-minute pitches, as you know in your hearts, because you are part of the audience for this remarkable collection of speakers, we're not short of brilliant ideas in Britain for how to make our world and our food system a better place. So this session is about concentrating on how we put these ideas at the heart of the plans for economic recovery. And we're going to need some really serious economic recovery if indeed this depression that we're plunging into now is the worst we've gone through in 300 years. So what we're going to talk about here in this 50 minutes is the practicalities of a revolution. But as Vicky Hurd pointed out in that last session, power and vested interests are against so much that could boost the economy and make our lives better in all kinds of ways, the quality of our lives. And Sustain just doesn't have the financial clout of Cargill or Mars or the big supermarkets or Nestle or Unilever. So what can we do? What can we really do? I mean, how do we bring food hubs into the mainstream? How do we learn to give up the kind of convenience that supermarkets have been selling us for so long? Well, as you'll see from your agenda, we have the panel for you. We have the panel for all of us. I'm not going to go into the details of their biography because you do have the agenda. There's Carolyn Steele. She's the author most recently of Citopia, How Food Can Save the World. And that's a thought out plan for how we can put food at the very center of society. She will be followed by Fatima Ibrahim, who's co-executive director of the Green New Deal. And Green New Deals here and in different parts of the West are what is going to save us, if we are going to be saved, from climate disaster. Geetie Singh Watson is an entrepreneur. She really knows how to run a business successfully. She started out in restaurants. She now has a new pub. I don't know whether it's actually open now in Totnes. But she is deeply involved in the organic movement. Luke Pollard MP is the Shadow Secretary of State for DEFRA. And sadly, Henry Dimbleby can't be with us. He's ill, poor man. But he's replaced by his sidekick and supporter and colleague, Tamsin Cooper, who's the director of the Green Alliance and the director of the National Food Strategy. Each of the panelists is going to have 5 minutes. I do not, like Ben, have a horn, but my brother recently gave me this. So I'm going to do this tinkling, this kind of loud musical sound at 4.5 minutes, because we really do want to get everybody's best ideas. So Carolyn, let's start with you. How are we going to bring about this food revolution?
Well, thank you very much, Sheila, and it's wonderful to be part of this discussion. And I have to say that those fast pitches that we just listened to have really fired me up. I mean, I do think we can do this. But it's really interesting that, I think all of us kind of feel the sort of elephant in the room during these kinds of discussions. We've got all, as you say, all the good ideas, the amazing stuff happening all around us. And yet we know that the sort of, as it were, the great ocean current of British food culture is still based on industrially produced cheap food. And it's how getting from where we are now to the world that I thoroughly enjoyed imagining with you for half an hour on the food program, where, you know, actually we live in a world where food is valued, which is what I call a good utopia, is the question. And, you know, I think, I mean, in the book I was proposing a series of things which are perfectly doable. It's just a question of whether there's the political will. I mean, the first big thing is to basically internalize the true cost of food. Of course, it's not just me proposing this. I mean, people like Patrick Holden have been proposing this for a long time, but basically true cost accounting with food. So, you know, you actually achieve, I'm going to actually say the words level playing field now, but, you know, it's precisely what we don't have in the food system. And I think many people are really worried about, you know, what's going to happen as, you know, the CAP subsidies are gradually withdrawn from farmers and they're awarded in ways yet to be worked out for kind of building hedgerows, which is absolutely fabulous and very, very necessary. But the whole question of what's going to happen to food that's produced in this very, you know, sustainable way, if it's just kind of left up against kind of random imports from places that have much lower standards and so on. So it would be a brave government that would do this, but I think weirdly, I mean, the sugar tax that Kath mentioned in the introduction shows that they can go there if we hold their hand, as it were. So anyway, that's a big thing. We need a new economic landscape, and the most obvious way of doing it would be to internalize the true cost of food, which frankly would make, you know, deeply unsustainable practices like industrial livestock production completely unaffordable, because they already are. So that's thing one. Thing two, that again is, actually there's two elephants in this room, because the other elephant is land. In order to flourish as humans, we need access to land. And I think at the moment we still don't have a government that understands the importance of this. So they're still trying to kind of, as it were, follow the old model where basically most of the land is already sort of owned by large landowners who don't necessarily sort of use it in the most productive way. And, you know, for me, the most interesting model I came across in my research was Henry George's proposal for a land value tax. This is actually something that was in Ebenezer Howard's model for the Garden City. And it effectively, I mean, it actually builds on ideas that people like George Monbiot are talking about, where basically we go towards private ownership, towards common ownership, which doesn't mean that you can't have sole use of land, but it just means that you pay a tax towards the community for the sole use of the land. This was actually one of the key ideas behind Ebenezer Howard's Garden City. And I think, you know, that's a really, really interesting thing to look at, because it has the effect of keeping farmland affordable and available. And I believe we need more farmers, far more farmers rather than fewer. But of course, if we revalue food, that's going to be possible. But they also have access, they need to have access to land to farm. And I'm really worried that the government is actually currently paying people to get out of farming, or that's part of the proposals, because it's completely the opposite of what we need to be doing. We need more people in farming, because we have to move towards a much more local, regional, regenerative model. And this is literally the opposite paradigm of the current kind of, you know, monocultural, you know, sort of mechanized model. And of course, we've had, again, wonderful examples today of very, very inspiring farmers who are showing that actually, if you do this, you can earn a lot of money and make the land extremely productive. So I think those are my headline ideas. It's basically revaluing food and understanding that you can address all of the major issues we face through the lens of food. I often talk about my food-shaped glasses that you put on. So really the headline is to make the point that this is not about food, it's about life and how we construct a good, sustainable, equitable, resilient, low carbon life. Food has to be at the center of it.
I'm unmuting myself. Carolyn, that's a wonderful summing up, and two absolutely key points, true cost accounting and land ownership. Fatima Ibrahim, your 5 minutes on how we're going to do this food revolution.
Thanks for having me, Sheila. And I mean, I completely agree with everything Carolyn has said. I'm really excited to be here, and I have to say a little nervous and hesitant because I'll admit I don't really have the answers, and I don't actually know much about food systems and farming. And I think that's part of the problem. As someone who's spent a decade working on climate change, building a movement towards a Green New Deal, food doesn't seem to feature or be at the center of much of the campaigning on climate change and nature, and particularly the Green New Deal. And that's concerning to me because I think I intrinsically know that there is no such thing as a Green New Deal, and there's no such thing as building back better from this crisis unless we look at our food systems and engage with how our food systems are in crisis. And I think through the pandemic, what we've had is a series of aha moments that we've all individually had in our own experiences of going through the pandemic. And that's one of the things at Green New Deal UK we recognized when we put together 100 organizations around a coalition for building back better from this pandemic, is realizing those aha moments and reflecting them back to the public and showing them that normal wasn't working. We don't want to go back to normal. We need to change our economic systems to serve people and planet. And I think in engaging in this conference and wanting to build partnerships, I want food to be central to that, because over the last few months, I've interrogated and engaged with how I consume my food, where I buy it from, who is preparing it, where is it coming from, walking, a few miles down the road just to make sure that I'm going to our local greengrocers, that I'm going to our local bakeries and not going for convenience. That has I've only been possible because the way that I work has changed. I'm at home. I can change how I think about my food and the time that I put towards that. And I think people who like sustain and people who are working on food systems are light years ahead of those of us who've been working on climate in thinking about this in a systematic way. We've only caught up, I think, in the climate movement of connecting the dots between, choices that we have on an individual level and what the systemic changes that need to be made are. So when we're making choices about how we travel and where we buy food, that's right at the end of the line. That isn't the bit that we should be focusing on. It's like, what leads people to make these choices? What gives them the agency to make these choices? And that's where I think we need to be telling a broader story and incorporating it when we're building a movement, that it's actually, the government needs to be investing to make this easier for us. The government needs to be incentivizing an economic model and a food production model that's aimed at creating thriving communities, that is centered on health, the health of us as humans, but also the health of our land, and not on one that's around production. How much can we create? I find it alarming that a third of our global food production is wasted. When in the UK in 2020, we were fighting for children to receive free school meals during the holidays. That I think is an injustice that's quite clear to everybody. And I think those are the things that we should be connecting together. In terms of solutions, I think the case for localism has potentially been won this year, and that's maybe a place that we need to expand. I think people are seeing why it's important to have resilient local communities and how the people in our communities are probably the best to make decisions on what we need. The other thing is at Green New Deal UK, a big focus for us in the last 2 months, but into next year, is green jobs. What are the areas of the economy that the government should be investing in that will help us close the gap on inequality, but also allow us to meet our climate targets, but also deliver for people? And farming is central to that. And how do we think about farming and good farming creating good jobs? And again, that comes to making sure that the government's investing in the right types of farming, that mechanization isn't replacing good jobs. We're not here to fight against all mechanization, but to fight against that, that's replacing good jobs, because farming is a place where we could be creating and could be contributing thousands of good green jobs to local people. I can see Sheila signaling to me, so I will wrap up. I think my biggest thing and answer to this question is we need more people like me who are leading organizations and movements in the climate movement to be working with the people in this community and to be working with farmers and making sure that farmers who are on the front line of the climate crisis, who are on the front line of inequality globally, are helping us lead this transformation that we're centering them.
Well, that was actually brilliant, Fatima, and it was also very honest, because I think those of us who think about food a lot have noticed that Green New Deals, well, there we are. You see, this is what you get when you're doing Zoom calls, your dog starts barking. Those of us who've been doing this can look at Green New Deals like in the United States and think, where's food? Where's food? Where's farming? Anyway, that was honest, and we'll look forward to discussing it afterwards. So let's move to Geetie. Geetie Singh Watson, entrepreneur, organic maven. Geetie.
Hi. Well, I thought I would tell you a bit about my business and how it happened. I grew up in a commune in the Midlands, and we were pretty much self-sufficient, and we were fair trade, we were politically driven, and we cooked from scratch. So everything that we did around food was also based around politics, and that was my indoctrination. So it was the impact on society and the environment. And I started working in restaurants, which I absolutely adored, but I could not believe how these cooks, these people working with food, didn't give a moment's thought to where the food was coming from. They were flying lamb from New Zealand when we had British lamb. They were actually, people didn't even have contracts then. So, you know, the way they were treating the human beings that were working in these restaurants were appalling. I often only lived off my tips. I had no wages, let alone any kind of rights. And I knew it could be different. And I discovered the Eagle Gastropub in where was it? Oh, in London somewhere. And thought it was just the best thing. And I knew I had to do that. I wanted to take a traditional old British pub and apply all my values and ethics and prove that you could run a restaurant that was really profitable, that had decent equality and employment practices, and was minimizing its environmental impact. And back then I did talk about minimize environmental impact. I now talk about actually having a positive environmental impact, because the way we farm, the way we procure our food can actually benefit the planet, as everyone's been talking about. So that was back in 1998. I opened my first pub. And so that was only, I was 3 years earlier than Sustain, which was quite exciting to discover, because they were just around the corner from the Duke. They knew it quite well. I then expanded to 3 sites, which I very quickly disliked, and went back to 1. We recycled and we composted. We bought directly from farmers. Our energy was green. We bought off green energy suppliers. I never bought a packet of snack food in my pubs in 25 years. I'm so proud of that. Back then I was aware that there were 73 billion bags of crisps being thrown away in Britain alone every year, which is just a horrifying fact. We've never transported any water. All these things I've done in this restaurant, in all my restaurants, while being profitable, while winning lots of awards, while getting brilliant reviews for our food and how we're operating. What I find really shocking is why more restaurants are not operating in this way. And what is quite exciting on the one hand is how many restaurants make those claims. So they'll use the word seasonal, organic, local on their menu when they're actually doing nothing. When you interrogate them, it's quite frightening how many lies are told you from restaurants, and it's particularly restaurants. When I first opened 25 years ago, trading standards would come and knock on your door and say, can you justify that? Can you explain that? Tell me where is, prove that's organic. They've been defunded, almost completely defunded. So who are the people who are going to hold us to account for these brave moves, the facts we're claiming? If we allow the greenwash to rule us, then we're lost, we're completely lost. So it comes back to government, it comes back to legislation. I believe the reason why I'm not a politician, despite being radically political, is because I feel politicians are curbed so often by the system. Whereas as an independent business, you can actually do something quite radical and be quite brave and prove that things can be done different. But behind that, we need legislation, we need accountability. And I think it's, well, it's shockingly lacking. It's one of the reasons why I'm certified organic, although you can't be anymore as a restaurant, which is, I'm having a bit of a fight with a soil association about that and trying to persuade them to bring back certification for restaurants. But it's the reason why I buy certified ingredients, fair trade and organic, and Marine Stewardship Council, Stewardship Council certified fish, because otherwise we're relying on people's claims. And that's very hard. It's hard enough buying off the farmer just down the road from you, where I can here in Devon, and to be sure they're following through on their process. If you're buying fish or if you're buying food from abroad, you can't possibly know those claims are actually factual. Are you telling me to stop now, Sheila?
I'm telling you, you're almost out of time, yes.
Yeah, well, I think I'm done anyway. That's good. There was something. Oh, so I think the opportunity here is to support radical, brave, small independent businesses to keep the money in our local economies and not send it out to big supermarkets where it's going elsewhere. And the second opportunity is to skill people. We need skilled cooks, we need skilled chefs, and we've shown in lockdown that people are actually quite excited by cooking. So the access to those ingredients, the access to those skills is a great opportunity for our government, but it comes from government. David, and there's one more thing, David Cameron talked about the big society, which was quite a good idea, but actually he defunded the big society. He took all the money away from all those individuals who were doing really effective things in our communities and then told us to work it out for ourselves. So I feel very nervous about our present government and the statements they make when they've really made so many lies. So us as
So fortunately for you, you are being followed by Luke Pollard MP, Shadow Secretary of State for DEFRA. So perhaps he could take up some of these things, although I think he has his own 5 minutes. So thank you very much, Geetie. There's a lot there. I love, to be reminded, that trading standards once worked and checked and are totally defunded now, or almost totally. Okay, let's go to Luke Pollard.
Thank you. Do you know, I really wish I could bottle this debate and share it with colleagues, because what we're really missing in politics is just this energy around food. Now, I think food needs to be more political, not more party political necessarily, but more political. And I think the danger about where we are at the moment within where food sits in the political debate is it kind of sits in the food poverty space. We have a debate around food poverty, but actually it's not a debate about food, it's a debate about poverty. There's more than enough food for everyone to eat 3 healthy, nutritious meals every day. So it's not about the food, it's about the fact that people can't afford to. So there's an element of discussion there. And then there's an element of discussion around the real problems that Brexit could bring in disruption of our food supply, which is partly an admission that we now live in a globalized food supply chain, that there is a real challenge to local supply chains, that we will happily import things from one side of the planet to another. And as long as it deals with the price point, then we don't need to look at the carbon intensity or the background of it. That's not enough. That's too narrow a debate around food. So we do need it to be bigger, we do need it to be bolder, and we're slowly getting there. So for the past 6 months, Parliament's been debating the agriculture bill. Now, my little sister's a farmer. I think farming's pretty important. However, it hasn't always had top billing within Westminster. Much of that is because it was an EU competency, but now we're getting it back. Whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, I'll leave you to decide yourselves. But now it is a Westminster competency. We need to upskill our Westminster politicians, because the idea that they have this awareness of not only fishing and farming, but food supply, about what happens on the land, about how industrialized agriculture is not only polluting our soils, but is also poisoning our rivers, is something that we don't have. So this needs to be not not present here, but it needs to be something that dying a little bit. Hopefully you can still hear me, but we do need to have a different approach.
I have lost you, Luke. I don't know if everyone else has a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we might have.
Can anyone else hear Luke?
Luke, try switching off your video and see if that helps with the connection.
I don't know what you think, Ben, but I think we perhaps better move on to Tamsin Cooper while we see if we can reestablish a connection with Luke to finish that. Yeah. Tamsin, who I said is stepping in for her colleague, Henry Dimbleby. Tamsin, how can we, bring about the revolution?
So much. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Sustain. And just to reiterate that Henry sends his apologies, and he was very much looking forward to joining you this afternoon. Just one minor clarification. I am a deaf civil servant, so I think you made reference to my previous role at Green Alliance, but I
did, yes, you're right. Sorry.
Civil servant and DEFRA, but Green Alliance I hold very dear. So I'm going to say just a very brief introduction as to where we're at on the National Food Strategy, and then to share with you 3 insights which are pertinent to the question we're talking about today. And indeed, as I listened to Carolyn and to Luke and to Fatima, I thought I'm about to repeat what everyone else has said. So clearly we're all in on the same track. So the National Food Strategy was commissioned almost 2 years ago by DEFRA's then Secretary of State, Michael Gove, and he invited Henry to do to undertake an independent review of the food system. And over the course of the last 2 years, we have cast our net far and wide. We've talked from everybody from young people to farmers to retailers to manufacturers to healthcare providers to MPs. Like, we have engaged far and wide across the country. And we published the first part of the National Food Strategy in July of this year, and we will publish part 2 in spring 2021. And I do invite you, if you haven't done so already, have a look on our website. There's an opportunity to sign up and express your interest in what we're doing. So when we launch this project in the spring, what we intend to do is to set out a vision for where the food system needs to be in 30 years' time. This is not our vision. This is not the vision of the team that is undertaking this work. We have worked and co-created that vision through the people we have met, through the young people we've engaged with. And this vision is to set a direction of travel with a series of goals and metrics to measure progress towards it. But we also want to set out a series of actions or a food plan for 2021 to set out what we think or what we recommend are the first steps on that journey. And that journey will take many forms and it will involve many people, and we can't possibly, through a strategy of this nature, prescribe all the steps along the way. But what the strategy aims to do, in effect, to describe how you would shift a system from one that has really primarily been engineered to focus on one variable to maximize the production of food, to a system that provides multiple outputs multiple outputs that society values: affordable food, dignified jobs, but also which not only promotes and sustains healthy diets and the health of us as individuals, but also sustains the health of our planet. And that will take some time. And in order to do that, in order to affect that paradigmatic shift, we set out a number of insights about how the system operates and what you need to know about it in order to make that change. And I'm going to share 3 of them with you now. And there are multiple others, and we've touched on waste and various other things about the use of land, and that comes into the strategy. So insight 1 is that any good food strategy will need to facilitate or recommend joined up government. And we've touched on this in a number of places this afternoon. Responsibility for food is dispersed across multiple departments with multiple objectives. And there's often tension in policy goals around standards, the economy, the polluter pays. These are often in tension. And the effect of this is to ensure that in those different departments is that food becomes a 3rd order priority rather than the primary, sort of 1st order priority that many of the contributors this afternoon have recognised. And so we will make a set of recommendations around the structural, institutional and legislative changes that are required to realign the governance of the system with this sort of 1st order priority status. The second insight is that we need to adjust for externalities in the system, and this is a point that Carolyn made so clearly. And we will argue that any good food strategy must systematically recognise, measure and adjust for the externalities in the system. We cannot continue to suppress or ignore them. And some of this is being done already, but not in a systematic way. And we've touched on issues about sort of the true cost of food. And what some of our analysis shows is that building in the externalities of the system won't necessarily increase the cost of food. There will be aspects of interventions in the system that will drive market innovations, and we set this out in the strategy. The third insight, the third and final insight today, is around what we're calling the power of love. And this clearly, and from all of the energy on the call today and on this and in your conference, there's so much more to eating than sustenance. And there's so much more to this system than a set of economic and market relationships. We all know that food connects people to people, people to place, people to nature. And so what does this insight tell us about both the how we fix some of the problems inherent in our system, as well as how we drive and deliver on the vision that we set out? What we are very convinced about is that this insight, this power of connection, will be important to sustain this journey. It will be important as we, in multiple ways, enact the changes that will need to be made to drive this system change. But also it will create the space for the behavioural changes that are needed as we transition towards healthy and sustainable diets.
Thank you very much, and you kept so beautifully to time. Now, I don't know, before we go to our first questions from the audience, do any of the speakers want to ask anything of anyone else? No?
Yeah, okay. Yes, if I may, Karen here.
Hello, this is?
Yeah, Karen, one of the people who was speaking.
Okay.
Yeah, I would like to ask Geetie about the serving of salmon and farmed salmon and the issues around the use of wild caught fish in the feed, because we believe this is not being properly tackled in certification.
Let's put that question, we've only got 20 minutes, so let's put that question to Luke Pollard. What's the Labour Party's, what's the opposition's view on this, Luke? Because I think you can now speak to us.
Yes, the gremlins in my internet have now gone away, so my rant is sadly cut short. I think when we're talking about our carbon intensity of food and the welfare of our food, we've got to bake that into the overall approach. And I think there is lots of good reasons to look at different forms of fishing and farming to say, what is the environmental impact? What is the carbon impact? What is the habitats impact? And there's frequently a lot of focus on carbon in this debate, but not a lot of focus on the biodiversity impact. That's partly because the biodiversity impact doesn't have a pounds, shillings and pence value to it. And I think we need to be much better at valuing biodiversity as part of it. When we are looking at a micro level about where we are on fishing, for instance, and on this, we need to start taking into account the wider impacts on food supply. So ever cheaper food, which is largely what supermarkets and our retail supply chain is driving at, can't be achieved without ever greater pressure on the primary producers, so on our fishers and our farmers. And that is not always incentivizing the best environmental behavior in their original production. And that's one of the reasons why within this debate, when we're talking about food, part of it is a regulatory approach, part of it is an individual approach. But the bit that frequently gets missed out is lots of fishers and farmers will have will regard what the supermarket supply chain does as more important than what the direction of travel is from government and what the direction of travel from consumers are, because they're the ones that pay their bills. And I think when it comes to kind of intensively farmed salmon and the food stock that it's used, and also the effects of that intensively farmed salmon on the natural world where it is farmed, I don't think those externalities have been taken into account. But equally, I don't think the supermarkets and the retail environment is adequately putting pressure on the delivery of better environmental standards versus just more fish for lower price, if that makes sense. And we don't have a debate that does that. So it's a good issue to raise. The answer might not necessarily just be regulatory, though.
Can I just do a follow-up question to that? I mean, Labour governments have been just as bad on the whole, I'd say, as a journalist, about food systems and leave it to Tesco as Tory governments. So Carolyn Steele brings up this, the true cost accounting as the external costs, the rivers and pollution, et cetera, how, as a politician, how likely do you think that is going to enter the debate? Given that we have a particularly leave it to Tesco government at the minute.
I don't think it currently easily interacts with the policies that we've got from the current government. And I would kind of agree to a certain extent about the governments for the last 30 years. I think the last Labour government was better than the coalition before it. There is borrowing from the 1945 Labour government, way before all our time. Food was regarded as a national security issue.
Yeah.
It wasn't regarded as a market economy function. And one of the elements that we're exploring as a party now is whether we need to take much more of those principles of food being national security, not because we're trying to militarize food, and I don't mean that, is in terms of if we're talking about sustainability, if we're talking about how much food we generate and produce ourselves as a country, reducing food miles, creating more jobs, being able to track provenance, for instance, rather than relying on overseas imports, but also recognizing that there's huge geopolitical instability, and food is part of that international instability as well. So we do need to have a much better focus on it. But frankly, if you're looking at where the government currently sits on this, they neither have a view on how much food we should produce. It's 60% currently. Should that be 65 or 70? I think personally there's a good case for that, but I want to hear from people as we develop that policy. Should we be loading in the wider costs of on the environment? I think we should. How you do that is genuinely difficult. I don't think there's an easy answer for it. And the Treasury's often ignored Dasgupta review, which looks at the economic costs of biodiversity. It's a really fascinating piece of work that is being heavily long-grassed as fast as you can put it in the long grass by government. Because if you start taking into account biodiversity costs, the costs of chopping down trees or poor soil health or river pollution, for instance, well, you suddenly have a very, very different economic model. And whether that is about the price of food, the whole food supply, whether it's about the cost of water, which I think would be a really important component part of it, which is hugely carbon intensive, that would change it. And I think we do need to recognise those, but I don't see that as something that the current government really wants to address. It's something that I'm quite keen on addressing in Labour's food policy, which we'll be consulting on to get ideas probably at Easter time next year. But we do need to be starting to build that in, because we're in the middle of a climate crisis. We can't pretend that we're not.
Thank you very much, Luke. There's a question here from Emily O'Brien, which is actually thanking Vicky Hurd earlier in the day. And she says, and this I'm going to ask Fatima to comment on this. She says, I'm concerned that many councils are looking at models such as municipal bonds, green bonds to fund climate change initiatives, but that food doesn't seem to be part of them. Fatima.
Yeah, I think that's a really important concern. And I think, again, it comes to, I mean, what we've seen and what we know is our local councils are not equipped or have the necessary funding or powers necessarily to enact the level of system change that we require them to. It's not to say that they don't have powers, but I think the focus of the Green New Deal, at least, is on the central government to be able to unlock both the investment but local powers for us to be able, both as citizens in our local communities, but also our local elected leaders, to be able to make those decisions that make sense for our communities. So I think the thing that I keep hearing back again and again when we engage with local councils, and it could be them just being deflective, is like a lack of investment. We have far too much going on, and our agenda is just thick and requiring much more support from central government. And I think 10 years of a Tory government has completely decimated local governments and the ability of local leaders to think wholesale system change. So I appreciate that food has been left off, but I think I also understand why food keeps slipping down the agenda for local governments that have just been tasked with far too much that the central government is really refusing to engage with.
I mean, that's a question that you could pick up on, Geetie, because I mean, as you brought up how there is no kind of checks, or very few now, or on restaurants, the whole hospitality industry, which could transform the lives of local suppliers. But as we've all discovered during this lockdown, so much of the meat we were eating that we were being told was British wasn't. It was coming from Brazil, and that's why there's been shortages of stuff. To Geetie, anyway, I won't go on. Go on.
Well, I think it's really interesting, and what's so exciting is it would take so little to shift everything, because we know that people want that kind of food. They want real bread, they want local food, they want seasonal food. I mean, I think local and seasonal need to come together, because that can be very confusing. You're buying from your local shop, but you're not actually buying anything seasonal or anything that's local in this country. So we need to be very careful of that term. We know the appetite's there because everyone's using the language on their menus and in the supermarkets. So the shift would be very easy. From the food citizens' point of view, we are able to buy into this message and this story. The vast majority of the population is. The problem is it's not being facilitated by government. And if that labelling was really carefully monitored, you can't make claims that aren't true. It would shift it like that. We know it. We would bring people along the journey. I, as a business, need to be able to use that term organic. I can only use it if I'm certified. You would be forced into it. And we've seen it happen in other sectors, which I'm sure I can recall one, but I can't right now. But it is perfectly possible.
Can we let Tamsin? This is a question from Lucy Bjork, but bears on what Geetie and Fatima have just said.
Yeah.
Can you expand on some of the mechanisms that you and Henry envisage being implemented to adjust for these externalities to address the true cost accounting goal?
So yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that we need to do, and it's a point that Lou touched on, is around measuring them and having a sort of legitimate and agreed framework for measuring both where the externalities fall, where the costs are borne in the system, and to collect a sort of robust data set around them. And I think, you know, if you look back to what happened with the Stern Review, that was when with climate, that was a sort of systematic sort of assessment of where the costs lie. And that was really transformative in the sense that basically we concluded that, yes, it was going to be costly, but the cost of inaction would far outweigh the costs, you know, in the present time. And I think we can do something similar on food and demonstrate that, you know, that the costs in the future are significantly higher. And then what we're doing is looking to see how you stimulate market innovations and where you can drive down costs and change sort of behaviour and production methods, so that those costs aren't necessarily always passed on either to the consumer or to the shareholder, as that's where costs tend to fall in the system. So, you know, so our first recommendation is going to be around measurement, but we're under no illusion that measurement affects change in and of itself. And then you have to have a sort of system, a policy and legislative system that addresses where those externalities lie. But I think we are more sort of enthusiastic, or we have more optimism about it than, say, maybe has been expressed. I think, you know, we can achieve this.
Thank you. There's a pessimistic question here from Pat Thomas, the former editor of Ecology magazine. Carolyn, would you like to talk about this? She says the UK government priority for food involves scaling up biotechnology rather than agroecology. That's the priority for investment and research. And the government believes that gene editing and synthetic biology will improve agriculture, enhance food security, and add millions of pounds to the UK economy. And this is, she says, a threat to sustainable farming, and we haven't talked about this yet. Would you like to talk about it now?
Yes, I would love to talk about that. Thank you very much, Pat, for that very important question. I mean, I've found this conversation so fascinating because I think in different ways we're all really saying the same thing, and it really needs to be said that thinking about food and good food and the right of everybody to eat well is about so much more than food. It literally is a different vision of a good life. And if you think about, you know, I mean, I hate the sort of phrase, how are we going to feed the world? It's so unhelpful on so many levels. Who's we to begin with? You know, does the world need to be fed? Or isn't it actually more about what is our common vision for a good life? And how then can we use the fact that we all have to eat 3 times a day to create that good life? So, for example, if you see, you know, an alternative vision of let's just all eat kind of, I don't know, lab meat or something. And I know that a lot of the people behind these foods begin, like Josh Tetrick, for example, is a vegan. He's trying to get away from the appallingness of you know, industrial livestock production in the US. But you end up with this thing that it doesn't actually engage with all of the other problems that we have to face about, you know, finding decent livelihoods for people, transforming our landscapes, actually creating conditions under which people can flourish. And this is why I always bring it back to money and land. You know, it's a much, much bigger question. So, for example, I mean, we've seen today, you know, examples of regenerative farming. You know, it's about working with nature. It's about a vision for what, you know, farming can be that can feed us, but also create a good life, can stimulate local economies, can solve the climate problem, you know, by embedding carbon in the ground. I mean, it's just, it is complex, and looking for silver bullet solutions is never ever going to be the answer. It's actually part of the problem, because it's like trying to say, let's solve the problem of life. You know, life is not a problem to be solved. It's a wonderful, joyous gift to be experienced. And this is why, I mean, for 200 years, sorry, I mean, I'm going to stop talking in a minute, but I mean, for 200 years, we've been on this weird trajectory of trying to pretend that the food problem's gone away. We've solved the problem of how to eat. Great, now we can just all loll about doing whatever. I've no idea. So Epicurus's great insight was that the answer to a good life is that you put the necessary back at the center and you get pleasure out of what is necessary. Nothing is more necessary than the need to eat. You know, food consists of living things that we kill so we can live. So food is life. So to cheapen food is to cheapen life. And you know, it's so important to understand that it is not an inconvenient problem to be solved. It's the heart of joy and pleasure and you know, leading a good life in harmony with nature and one another.
Well, I love us bringing us back to absolute basics, Karen, that it's not a problem to be solved in that way. There's a last, because we're running out of time, but a last general question for us all from Gareth Morgan. And he says, have we all got distracted about whether food is a public good per se? It's probably not. And that allowed the government to wash their hands of these things. So how do we develop our thinking about all the other key food issues, quality, food resilience, nutrition, dietary good health, to make clear the need for government intervention? Luke, do you want 10 seconds, 25 seconds on this, and then I'll come back to everyone else on the panel?
We're winning the war of language on this. The language of food is going in the right direction. The policy that sits behind it is not. And so we need to demand that if they're stealing the language, just as if the government's stealing the language of a Green New Deal and building back better, that they have to take the policy to go with it. You can't only have the headlines, you've got to have the policy to go with it. And if we get both, then we're on the right direction. If we don't, then we're not.
Geetie? Geetie? Okay, well, we seem to have lost Geetie. Let's go to Fatima.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Luke, and I'll say what he said at the start, which is I think we need to be very clear about food being political. I was just hearing Carolyn speak, and I was remembering, I mean, I was born in Ottawa in Canada, a city that is a capital city, but has 1,000 farms within the city limits. And my relationship to farming and food was entirely different in my first 10 years in life than it is now that I live in London. So it's also about, you know, changing the culture that we have around food and making sure that, you know, farming isn't an abstract idea, which it is to many people who look like me actually and live in cities like I do. So I think it's about making food political again too.
Tamsin? Thanks, Fatima.
Thank you. So I think it's a combination of leadership. I think it's a combination of governance. One of the, where I started my reflections today, I think, you know, we have to get the governance right in order to elevate food policy. So it's a coherent policy rather than a set of dispersed policies on related issues. So leadership, policy coherence and governance. And I agree with Fatima, I think like fundamentally this is about cultural change, but we know that cultural change and the sort of behaviours can shift quite quickly when conditions facilitate that. So we will need, the shift will require change on those three levels.
Thanks. Carolyn, do you agree with Tamsin? You know, we can do this cultural shift. It can happen relatively fast.
I love that William Gibson comment, you know, the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. I mean, you know, you couldn't sit through the last hour and a half of these absolutely extraordinary people. I mean, I'm actually getting chicken skin just literally being here and hearing these extraordinary people. Yes, we can do this. But it really does require, I mean, you know, I think we just have to realize that the old model of society based on this total fantasy of cheap food is over. It's very 20th century. We're totally beyond it. I mean, as Luke said, and many other people today have said, you know, we can't have food in a silo anymore. You know, we've got to put it at the center. And you know, it's not this kind of thing over there. It's literally front and center. We consist of the meals that we've eaten in our lives. Every atom in our body consists of the meals that we've eaten in our lives. You know, the food that we eat tonight is going to shape not only our physical bodies, but the planet. You know, it's so powerful. And there's just no, I mean, I really, as you know, I want there to be, you know, a Ministry of Food or Department of Food at the center of government. Food affects everything. It connects everything. To value food is to value life. It's that simple.
Geetie, valuing food, valuing life, can we make that kind of huge cultural change?
Yeah, absolutely. Carolyn, you're just brilliant. So question everything, you know, every pound you spend, every moment you spend your pennies, you should be thinking about the impact it's having on society. In the light of our government not actually leading us in the way we want them to with food, that's how we should spend our money. So support the right businesses. Go to all of your fridges this evening and have a good old look. And can you really justify what you've got in there? Occasionally there's a compromise, a conscious compromise that you have to make, but otherwise you should only be eating the very best ingredients and spreading the good word. And with every penny you spend, those businesses get bigger, and we can change society through how we spend our money.
You all fill me with great hope. You're a marvelous bunch, and you did amazingly for remaking the world in 5, 6, 7 minutes each. I just wanted to say something that there's someone called Peter Samson who said 2 things that interested me. He said, you know, the issue around politicians, we can play a role talking to our own MPs, putting to them the centrality of food. And he also points out that the current Reith lectures, and I agree with him here, are relevant to what we're talking about, because it is about revaluing things that are being undervalued by that free market economy that, as we know, is not free at all. Anyway, thank you for taking part in this wonderful session. I feel terrible that it's not longer, but I have to hand back to Ben Reynolds now and to Sustain, and thanks Sustain for making this possible.